for years. That's how long the world had gone without hearing Tony Dow's voice, without a new photo, without a single word from the woman who loved him longer than most marriages last. And then, out of nowhere, she spoke. Not to a tabloid, not for attention, but because she finally felt ready to tell the truth about the man millions thought they knew as Wally Cleaver, and the man she actually spent 45 years married to. What she said didn't just honor his memory, it reshaped it. For decades, Tony Dow was frozen in the American imagination as a teenager in a cardigan, walking through a black and white kitchen, giving his little brother advice about girls and homework. Leave It to Beaver made him famous before he was even old enough to vote, and that fame never fully let go of him. Not in the 60s, not in the 80s, not even in the years after he'd quietly stepped away from Hollywood altogether. But the real story of Tony Dow was never really about Wally Cleaver. It was about a boy from a working family who stumbled into stardom, spent the rest of his life trying to prove there was more to him than a sitcom character, and built a marriage so steady that his wife would later call it the truest role he ever played. Tony was born in Hollywood in the mid-1940s, though his childhood had little in common with the glamorous image people might assume. His mother had once worked in silent films as a bathing beauty and stood in as a body double for a famous actress of that era, and his father was a home builder, a man who worked with his hands. Tony grew up in Van Nuys, in a household that valued effort over image, and by all accounts he never set out to become an actor at all. He simply auditioned, almost on a whim, and found himself cast as the older brother in a new family sitcom that nobody expected to become a cultural touchstone. Leave It to Beaver ran through the late 50s and into the early 60s, and while it wasn't always a runaway ratings hit during its original broadcast, it found a second life in syndication that turned it into something bigger than television. Reruns introduced Wally Cleaver to generation after generation of new viewers, and Tony, almost by accident, became a permanent fixture in American living rooms. He received sacks of fan mail. He was treated as a teen idol, and he carried all of it with a kind of quiet humility that people who knew him would later say defined him, far more than any role he ever played. But here's the part that gets lost in the nostalgia. Being Wally Cleaver became both the greatest gift of Tony's life and one of its heaviest weights. When the show ended, he faced the same wall so many child stars run into. Producers, audiences, even casting directors struggled to see him as anyone other than the dependable teenager from that kitchen. Rather than let that define the rest of his life, Tony did something a lot of former child stars never manage. He kept working, kept adapting, and kept refusing to let one performance become the entirety of his story. Through the 60s and 70s, he picked up guest roles on shows like Adam, 12, and The Mod Squad, later appearing on Knight Rider as well, taking whatever work let him keep building a career on his own terms. He also served in the California Army National Guard during the Vietnam War era, where he worked as a photographer for a special services unit, developing an eye for visual storytelling that would end up shaping the rest of his professional life. During the 70s, he studied journalism and filmmaking while working construction jobs on the side, a stretch of years that had nothing to do with fame and everything to do with figuring out who he wanted to be once the cameras of his childhood had moved on. In 1977, he took a small, self-aware jab at his own wholesome image by appearing in the comedy The Kentucky Fried Movie, poking fun at the squeaky clean persona that had followed him for 2 decades. It was a small moment, but it said something about how Tony approached his own fame. He wasn't trying to escape Wally Cleaver. He was trying to show people there was more underneath. When a revival series brought Leave It to Beaver back years later, Tony returned to play an older version of Wally, but this time his contribution went far beyond acting. He directed several episodes and wrote at least one, stepping fully into a creative role behind the camera. That shift turned out to be a preview of the career he'd spend the following decades building. He worked as a producer, a visual effects artist, a writer, and a director on a range of projects, including work on Harry and the Hendersons, the sitcom Coach, the science fiction series Babylon 5, and the film Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. Very few of the people who grew up watching him as a teenager ever realized how much he'd done on the other side of the camera. He wasn't chasing headlines. He was simply building a career, quietly and consistently, the same way his father had once built houses. Through all of this, Tony maintained any of the most enduring friendships in Hollywood, with his former on-screen brother, actor Jerry Mathers, who played Beaver. Their bond lasted well past 60 years, long after the cameras stopped rolling on their childhood roles, a friendship built on something far more real than a shared television set. But behind the steady career and the public image of the wholesome former teen star, Tony was carrying something heavier. In his 20s, he began struggling with depression, at a time in American culture when almost nobody in the public eye spoke about mental health openly. Rather than hide it, Tony chose to talk about it. He took part in producing a self-help video aimed at helping other people recognize and confront depression, using his own experience to tell viewers that this kind of struggle could touch anyone, regardless of fame or success. It was a strikingly vulnerable move for someone of his era and his level of visibility, and it revealed a side of him that had nothing to do with a sitcom character and everything to do with real courage. As the years went on, physical health issues gradually pulled Tony further away from acting, and by his 40s he'd essentially left the entertainment industry behind. He didn't treat that departure as a loss. Those close to him described it as something closer to a reset, a chance to focus on the people and pursuits that mattered most to him, away from studio lots and premiere nights. It was around this stage of his life that Tony discovered a new creative outlet entirely: sculpture. Working mostly in bronze, he began creating pieces built around themes of endurance, strength, and resilience, subjects that clearly meant something personal to him. His work eventually earned real recognition in the art world. In 2008, he exhibited his sculptures at the Carrousel du Louvre in Paris, one of the most prestigious art venues in the world, with one piece in particular, a work called Unarmed Warrior, drawing significant attention. For a man once boxed in by a role he took on as a teenager, standing in a Paris exhibition hall as a recognized sculptor was its own quiet triumph. None of this professional reinvention happened in isolation. Behind Tony, for the majority of his adult life, was Lauren Shulkind, a mosaic artist from New York whom he met in the late 70s during a casting session for a commercial. Their connection formed quickly, and they married in the summer of 1980, beginning a partnership that would eventually stretch across more than 4 decades. Tony had been married once before, to a woman named Carol Marlowe, and the two had a son together, Christopher, born in the early 70s before that first marriage ended. Lauren embraced Christopher fully, and together she and Tony built a blended family rooted far more in quiet, everyday love than in any Hollywood spotlight. Christopher would later follow his father into a small piece of the family legacy, briefly playing a younger version of Wally Cleaver in the revival series, though he ultimately chose to build a private life away from the entertainment industry, prioritizing family over fame in much the same way his father eventually did. As the decades passed, Tony became a grandfather, and those closest to him say that role, quiet and largely unseen by the public, meant more to him than almost anything his career had given him. By 2022, the family was facing something they had kept almost entirely private. Tony had been diagnosed with liver cancer that May, and for months the news stayed largely out of public view while he underwent treatment. Occasionally, loved ones shared brief updates, including requests for prayers, but the full weight of what the family was going through remained mostly hidden, a private battle carried quietly behind a very public legacy. Then, in late July of that year, something happened that no one in the family could have anticipated. A message appeared on Tony's official social media page announcing that he had died. It spread instantly, as these things do, and fans around the world began mourning a man they'd grown up watching, flooding social media with tributes and memories. Only hours later, his team clarified that the announcement had been posted in error. Tony was still alive in hospice care, in the middle of what would turn out to be his final days. The mistaken post was later attributed to the immense emotional strain Lauren was under while caring for her husband around the clock, a devastating glimpse into just how serious things had become behind closed doors. Christopher and his wife stepped in to clarify the situation publicly, asking fans for patience and privacy while the family dealt with an unbearably painful moment that had suddenly become very public. Lauren later apologized for the confusion, and most people responded with understanding rather than criticism, recognizing the sheer exhaustion of caring for a dying spouse while the entire world was watching. In a strange and painful way, That premature announcement gave the public an early, unintended window into just how close to the end things really were. The following day, on July 27th, 2022, Tony Dow passed away at the age of 77, surrounded by Lauren, Christopher, and the people who loved him most. His son delivered the confirmed news to the public, closing out one of the more emotionally chaotic 48-hour stretches in recent celebrity memory. Tributes poured in almost immediately, from fans who'd grown up on Leave It to Beaver reruns to longtime colleagues, including heartfelt words from Jerry Mathers, the man who had played his little brother on screen and remained one of his closest friends off it for more than 60 years. For a long time after that, Lauren stayed quiet. She didn't do interviews. She didn't post lengthy tributes. She simply grieved, privately, the way most widows do, without cameras or headlines. And that silence is part of what makes her decision to eventually speak feel so significant. When she finally chose to share her memories publicly, years after his passing, she didn't focus on his fame or his most famous role. She talked about a 45-year marriage that, in her words, only grew stronger with time. She spoke about his kindness, his humility, and the steady presence he brought into every room, long after the television lights had gone dark. She described caring for him in his final days not just as an act of duty, but as something that revealed a kind of grace and acceptance the two of them found together, even in the hardest circumstances imaginable. Lauren also made a point of describing who Tony was when no one was watching, away from any script or spotlight. Generous, funny in a low-key way, genuinely humble, even after a lifetime of public recognition. She wanted people to understand that the real man was, in many ways, even more admirable than the character that made him famous, because his warmth wasn't written by anyone. It was simply who he was. Christopher, too, eventually spoke about his father in ways that added new depth to the public understanding of who Tony really was. He didn't just call him a father. He described him as a mentor, a coach, someone who shaped his life quietly, through patience and consistency, rather than grand gestures. It's the kind of tribute that doesn't make headlines the way a scandal would, but it says everything about the kind of man Tony actually was at home, where it mattered most. What makes this story worth revisiting, for years after his passing, isn't just nostalgia for a 50s sitcom or curiosity about a Hollywood widow finally breaking her silence. It's the reminder underneath all of it. Tony Dow spent his entire adult life being recognized for a role he played as a teenager, a role that, however beloved, barely scratched the surface of who he actually was. He battled depression before it was socially acceptable to admit to it. He rebuilt a career from the ground up after Hollywood tried to box him into one identity. He found unexpected success as a sculptor in his later years, exhibiting work in one of the most respected galleries in the world. And through all of it, he had one constant: a wife who stood beside him for 45 years, through fame, through reinvention, through illness, and finally, through goodbye. Lauren's decision to speak, years after losing him, wasn't about reopening old wounds. It was about making sure the world remembered the whole man, not just the character. Wally Cleaver gave Tony Dow his fame, but it was the quiet decades that followed, the sculptures, the friendships, the marriage, the fatherhood, that gave his life its real meaning. And now, thanks to the woman who loved him the longest, that fuller story finally has a voice. If this look at Tony Dow's life and the love story behind it moved you, consider liking and subscribing for more honest looks at the real people behind the characters we grew up watching. And stick around, because there's another remarkable story waiting right after this one.